that stayed on or anybody that's joined. It's me again, I'm afraid, but there we go. We'll get through it. So just wanted to talk about succession planning and handover. I think there were some really great conversations there, and I'll touch briefly on the SU point as we go through. But again, as we were doing in the last session, if you have any questions as we go through, just type them in and we'll stop and we'll discuss. Just a quick look at the handover process, what makes a good one, how yourselves as university advisors can support that process. A look at the procedures that we have in place to help streamline that process and to make it a little bit easier, the sustainability review process, the opportunity of summer action, which hopefully builds that momentum from the handover process, and looking at what we've got in the interim to help. Where have we got? Right, so there are a whole host of different ways that teams do this, and there is no golden answer for what is the best method or what produces the best next leadership team. Sometimes it's a healthy dose of luck, sometimes teams will have clear processes in place. We're working on resources to hand out to people to help them streamline this process and that they can use, but we are obviously conscious that the more documentation you give people to follow, that it can sometimes become overwhelming. But as a general rule of thumb, you're going to want a shadowing process, and I think quite most importantly is an objective setting and an evaluation of the year, which we have as part of our sustainability review. We did touch upon briefly interviews in that discussion, and I'll come back to that as we go on. Again, so what was mentioned was the student union and the guild. Yes, I think that's 90-80% of our teams do come under the SU, and there might be some flexibility with some teams, but I'll give some examples in a minute for what might work or might not. What we do from our side to help facilitate that process, we run an event alongside our Enactus alumni called Future Leaders Training, which is on the 10th of February this year on a Saturday in Amazon headquarters in London, in Holborn, which is a day to bring together potential future leaders, whether they be team leaders, vice presidents, project leaders. Every team has 2 spaces, I think 3 spaces, definitely 2, who they can come along to that event. The agenda is essentially based on getting them thinking about their own handover and what they can go back and ask their current leadership team for. It's about motivating them and understanding the types of requirements that an Enactus role has, but also there are former team leaders on hand to say, these are the kind of challenges you might face, these are the kinds of things that you get out of being an Enactus leader and the kind of successes that you can have and some of the things to look out for on that journey. So it's a really useful event, and definitely encourage yourselves to recommend it to the teams if you can. We normally have great feedback, and I think one of the most helpful points for that is it brings together everybody. That networking and peer-to-peer element is massively helpful for our students, and in between now and nationals it's the main touch point, and the next time that this group of students might be meeting is our leadership training in June, which I haven't put on here, but is also part of that handover process, if you will. Because again, these are bookends to the handover process. So you might have identified a group of students who are either keen to take over, or somebody who said you might step up to a leadership position and they can attend future leaders training. And then they would probably start shadowing, objective setting, doing some handover meetings, and then go through nationals, probably go into leadership training in June, where they receive more formal training about running an Enactus team, and that would lead directly into the summer period of time, where hopefully they are striving to achieve different objectives in the run-up to September. So the idea is that there's constantly a process in place. So if we look at this, it's basically a timeline of where we are and the different touch points that students will have. When should people start thinking about handover? Hopefully your teams are already thinking about it. If they're not, it's definitely worth asking the question. Well, that's a helicopter. It's very noisy here today. So you want them to be thinking about it as soon as possible out of the exams. We always recommend, when we're talking to students thinking about things in December, who might be the types of candidates that want to step forward. Are they have already experience in the team, whether it's CRE or the project leaders? Do they have a real appetite or a hunger to progress and do something with the team? Those are the types of people that you'd want to invite to future leaders training. Hopefully for future leaders training, they if they haven't already expressed an interest in the roles they want, then they'll come back with more of an understanding of what position they might want to be in. Around that time, you want there to be a process in place of shadowing, meeting yourselves, meeting your program staff, meeting the rest of the support network, so they can be in meetings and get to know everybody. Around the regionals and national expo period, I'd recommend that these future leaders are the ones that start taking some of that workload and kind of testing themselves, and an opportunity for the current exec to set some standards and see the kind of the level that the new leaders are operating at. It's really useful, and especially considering a lot of our team leaders will be third years and it'll be a busy time of year. Sometimes it can be useful for those more earlier students to get involved and start taking some responsibilities early. After Expo, and you'd ideally have your whole leadership team in place by Expo. We can talk about what would happen if you don't have that, but ideally you'd at least have your team leader and CRE in position. Following that, there would be what we would call it a sustainability review, and I'll focus on that later as we go on, but it's essentially a review of the year and a look to the year ahead. Going to exams, off the back of exams, there's the leadership training event in June, and then straight off the back of that, summer action, which actually begins the first day of the new Enactus year, so the day after Nationals until Nationals next year. That's as we would term it, the summer time, but really an opportunity for teams to focus more on the structure and strategy of their team. A lot of students will obviously be remote. They might have a lot of international students, or they might be based all across the UK. So really an opportunity for them to focus more on the things that, if they can have them in place by September, they'll be a lot more successful. So that's organising their recruitment plans, planning their budget, coming up with project strategies, whatever that might be. A useful time to get it done in the summer as opposed to September when it gets crazy for them. And that is incentivised, but we'll talk about summer action as we go on. But essentially the message from this is that students should be thinking about it now. Generally speaking, the longer the shadowing process, the more successful the team will be. Obviously, no particular fixed time. I've seen teams who will have a big handover day where they pull everybody together and they just prepare all their documents and swap them on that day. That's probably not enough time, but there's a middle ground. But you want to have people identified, potential people by FLT, ideally. Some of the challenges, I think we talked about some of these, having the right members. A lot of the time, and I see it a lot, that teams don't necessarily have role descriptions. What does the role require? What are the kind of capabilities? Who are the kind of students that would be interested in these roles? If you don't have that on written down somewhere, you're relying on somebody to say you'd make an excellent team leader, as opposed to saying this is the list of qualities we'd expect. This is the kind of tasks that we'd expect. There is a generic team leader template that we have available that teams can adapt. But again, it's the kind of thing where if any committee position or a project leader role, best practice would be to have something in place to show what that role requires. Time limitations, again, is the challenge, especially as we start getting into essay submission times and around Easter. If we're not starting early, and this is why we talk about starting in January, Feb, then that handover process really is going to end up rushed. So I think it's something to just be aware of. You don't want to get to regionals without the team at least knowing who they want to be in position, or knowing that there isn't anybody to fill that particular role. There are times where it might be better for the team to wait until September and do a fresh recruitment there for certain committee positions than it is just fill every position with the people who are left. And we do see that a lot, and sometimes that can be a challenge. Yeah. So the rules and regulations, we talked about AGM being one particular way. Elections, generally speaking, that's the standard format of an SU or a guild. Every team member should have the right to put themselves forward for a position. There is normally a pitch, and then they become elected, but there are sometimes other rules and regulations from SU. There tends to be a mandatory training requirement. Most SUs run training on the kind of processes that they want them to run. So sometimes that's giving equal opportunities, or that might be training on a particular back end. I know that a lot of students have access to edit small pages on the SU website. It might be financial training that the SU as risk assessment training. So there tends to be normally a 2-hour training session along those lines that most committee members have to attend, otherwise they're not ratified. Sometimes it would be society constitutions that are required. Again, these things slip under the radar. It tends to happen a lot with Enactus teams because they're different to a lot of societies. Normally, Enactus teams might think, oh, that might not apply, or the SU might forget to ask, and then you can end up in a position where halfway through the year you find out something's missing, and that can cause a problem for a team. So it's important that somebody knows in the team what the relationship is. Ideally, as part of a set of university advisors, or as part of the support network, at least you'd have somebody from the SU supporting the team. So whether that's a sabbatical officer that sits on the advisory board, or whether that's somebody more permanent in the SU that helps the team, that a VP or a team leader can talk to you about those requirements. If no one is willing to step up to a leadership position, obviously a challenge. You might get to a point where people think being a team leader might be too much for them. I think at that point you'd want to consider maybe co-leadership, or thinking about somebody taking the job temporarily, over the summer period, perhaps until September, where there could be another recruitment window. Project handover, difficult time again, very much feeds into the earlier session on audit. If people aren't collecting evidence of what they're doing, when a project leader takes over, they're not necessarily going to know where to begin. They might end up doing the same thing time and time again. Talked about that contact list. Understanding what the relationships are with particular partners can be tricky. So it's something that ideally you'd have some kind of A4 document or whatever it is, something that says, look, this is what we're doing, these are who we're talking to. A challenge is sometimes for teams on local projects that nobody's actually based locally. There you might think during refreshers, can we recruit some people who are local students that might be interested in working on projects? And the last one is boundary setting. Tends to be some team leaders might be very protective of their team, or project leaders very protective, and they won't necessarily let the new team leaders do what they want. So it's important to have clear defined outcomes. We're handing over by this date, we're doing this is the standard procedure. If that's in place, it stops the arguments down the line. So here, just moving on to kind of some of the key actions teams can take. Just a checklist of things that are required. Really useful, very simple, really basic. We do have one that we'll be giving out soon, a new one that looks at things. Role descriptions, I did mention it, but I think are really the most important one. And generally speaking, there are examples from SUs, but even still, just looking at the type of volunteering roles that are on SU university website, I think those can be really useful. And what's handy with drawing that, and perhaps having oversight from your side, is understanding what kind of guidelines you might want from that. So we was in a meeting yesterday with the university advisors, and we talked about what we want the baseline to be for a team leader. Minimum meetings every 2 weeks, the team leader meeting with the university advisor every 2 weeks, project leaders booking in sessions with enterprise advisors at least once a quarter, because having that enshrined in a role description just means that we can kind of remove some of the headaches further down the line, and have a degree of performance measurement as well, and helps team leaders understand what the actual requirement from the role is. Passwords, the basics. I mean, these things always get lost. People try and access the Twitter or the Facebook or all the rest of it. Sounds simple now, but when you get to September and everybody's scrambling to put a Facebook post up and nobody knows how to get in there, that can obviously be a challenge. Contacts, there are a CRE report, but that probably relies on there being good CREs for one point, and then also that tends just to be external business advisors as opposed to who are the contacts in the university people can talk to, who are the people in projects, who are the project partners, who are the local charities, who are the alumni that we talk to. So again, documenting all these things, inventories. It's the time of the year where people start losing banners and leaflets, and they get lost in people's houses. So just useful things to think about. And I think the shadowing period meeting members is so important. Nothing worse than, from your perspective, not meeting the people you're going to be working with for the next year. The same from our side, and we want to have those communications, understand the types of people that want to take over the leadership roles in Enactus, and understand where we can support them. So I think it's one of those things early on. If the sooner we can meet the people who are meant to be the next leaders of the teams, the easier it is for us to start building those relationships early on. And the last point is making sure that we follow procedures, ADMs, the rest of it. Nothing worse than a team facing sanctions for not following an SU code because they didn't think it applied to them. So, how can university advisors support? First question is there a handover plan? That's the question we ask them, and that's the question that I think is always the first at this time of year. Do you know who's going to take over the team? How would you speak to them? Yes, Rosie. I think that it works really well where an SU representative might not necessarily want to be a university advisor. If they do, that's great, but they might not have the capacity to do that, but they might be able to sit on an advisory board and meet with a team of business advisors and with everybody else, and that can be really useful. A lot of the time SUs will have good contacts and good knowledge around volunteering and can sometimes ease the process. What will happen is sometimes SUs might get a little bit protective, and active teams tend to be doing different things, and if an SU representative doesn't understand that, but an active team is a society, then there can be a disconnect. So I'd always recommend that any active team have an SU representative on an advisory board. If that is impossible, what I used to do when I was a team leader, I used to meet university advisor every 2 weeks, and I used to meet my SU contact every month, just to update them on what we were doing. And of course, they were in our mail chains and the rest of that, so they were updated. And yes, as Rosa said, invite them to observe national competition. I think the more people from an institutional perspective that understand what Enactus is doing, the easier anything is, I think. Encouraging members to attend future leadership training, the more events that these students are able to attend, the more that they get an understanding. It's all very well us saying things and as program staff or as university advisors, but what really moves things forward, I think, is a lot of the peer-to-peer stuff and understanding what other Enactus teams are doing around the country. It really is invaluable, and we don't have a massive amount of touch points throughout the year, so if they can attend these events, it's normally very useful for the team moving forward. And I think especially when it comes to understanding what they can do or whether the role is right for them, better they understand that at one of these events as opposed to waiting several months into the year and thinking, actually, this isn't for me. Again, if team leaders, if you are regularly meeting them or somebody pops up out of the blue and says, oh, we'd love to have a meeting, you can always ask them, do you know who is going to be succeeding you in the role? Can you bring them to the meeting? To kind of encourage their thinking on that. Involved in the process of selection. So we did talk about interviews. Sometimes that happens. In a few cases, there are teams that will interview for certain roles. There have been some cases where we've approached an SU. I mean, I've been in meetings with SUs and said, look, this is why Enactus requires interviews for the role. If we can make it fair, is that something you'd be interested in? So we have had an SU say, we're happy to do interviews if the university advisor is there and there's a representative from the union and a current student is interviewing them. So that can work, but that's a discussion that needs to be had with somebody at the SU, somebody senior, tends to be. For those who can't interview, I think meeting the team early on, once there's a group of individuals who express an interest, if you can get that early meeting on it, it's almost an interview in itself. And what you want to get to is a point where if there are elections, there's only one standing role. They already know which role they want to take. They're keen to the role, and they've discussed with the support network why they're right for that role. And then you get to a point where you're at AGM and the vote is between the one person standing and then no eligible contender. So that's the kind of process you can get to if you start it early. I think, as I said in the bottom point, understanding what the guidance is for team leaders and project leaders. Think about the relationship you've had with your team in the last year. Has it been what you want? What worked really well? What didn't necessarily work? And how can we build that into the process? Because generally speaking, team leaders wouldn't want to communicate. It's just they don't know how often they're meant to do it or what the best practice is. So I think as university advisors and as program staff, we can be a little bit prescriptive with the kind of processes that teams embed. Yes, it's always student-led, but we can give them an idea of what might make it easier for them. And if you can start building in those processes into role descriptions, it starts to codify things, it starts to build a little bit of structure. And I think that can really help during a period which can be quite difficult, quite busy. So one of the things then that to ease this process during this handover process is what we have as a sustainability review, and we've been doing these for many years, and they've changed how they look, but I will very quickly share one with you, and I know how to do this now, hopefully. So the sustainability review here is an evaluation tool for the team, but also an objective setting one for next year. So this should be completed between the outgoing committee and the incoming committee and the program staff, and sometimes maybe for part of it or for all of it if you can. You might want to be involved in this process. They should be sharing this with you when completed, just so that you've got an idea of what works or what doesn't. It does set some of those baseline requirements that we would set the team, such as they must have one university advisor, but are you in regular contact with those people? Are you making an effort to reach out to people? Looks at the baseline of team membership, how many people should be in the team, are you running training events for your team, do you have recruitment plans in place, do you have an induction process for your new members, financial sustainability, did you apply for any ITCs last year, do you have enough money in the bank to run things, can you attend training, support network engagement, do you have a CRE, are you running advisory board meetings, and a lot of this is for teams to go, oh, no, I haven't done that. Should we be doing that? Should we think about that? And then building that into their plans, or why haven't we done this in the past? This is something that we could be doing. So it's just to kind of give them a little bit of structure during this handover process to be thinking about some of the objectives they might want to build into their plans for the year ahead. There's a little matrix here that looks at the strength of their project portfolio. Generally speaking, you'd want a mixture of different types of projects that engage things, but I think the key bit from this point is, do they have strategy projects to engage people in different ways? Do they have commercial projects to generate revenue? Do they have projects that might not necessarily meet the Enactus criterion that they'd be presenting, but might bring a lot of students into the team, such as consulting projects or even employability or outreach projects, something the university might be really excited in, but won't necessarily be presented at competition, but might get people understanding the brand a little bit more. And then there's a strategic planning session. So we'd send this review out to the teams to start filling in their own bits, and then we'd have a meeting with them to discuss kind of some of their answers and to go through it in more depth. So based off all of the questions in that team index, the yes/no ones, there's bits here to build in plans. So, you know, how do you want to recruit? What are your retention plans? How do you want to move forward? Section for comments from us. You know, how do you want to work with your university advisor? How do you plan to generate revenue? The SWOT analysis of the team, and then a breakdown of the projects. And ideally, once you have a collection of these over the years, then you have a tailor-made handover document and something to review and understand where the progression has been over the last few years. So every team will be asked to complete this. It's something we will do following nationals, but it's kind of a really useful tool for them to be working on. Go back to the PowerPoint. Yes, so as I was saying, we kind of walk through that, so we don't need to discuss it in too much detail, but I'd be keen to hear in comments whether you've seen this before or whether it's something that teams have engaged you on. I think that there's work to be done. We changed it slightly last year to kind of make it a bit more all-encompassing, but our idea was that we would share that more with the network and with the support network. So if you haven't seen it, we're able to share the one that's just gone with you, and then we'll make sure that we bring you into the process in the next one. Where have we got? And that leads into then summer action, which is always a difficult time of year for most Enactus teams. You've just finished your exams, you want to run away and have holidays, or you've got to work over the summer, or you want to enjoy yourself. But obviously there's an awful lot of time then that's not spent on Enactus teams, and some will be running projects. So summer action is a way to incentivize working over the summer, but also to add a little bit of structure to a time where we know statistically if teams are working over the summer, they will have a stronger launch into September, which means they'll have a stronger year overall. So it is a crucial time for students to engage, and we do have a program around that. So there's a summer action pack which details all the different actions teams can be taking remotely. So that is everything from at the very beginning stage, creating mission statements and meeting templates and how many training events you want to run, up to things like if you're doing international projects over the summer, we have things on how to conduct needs assessments and do analysis. But even planning projects you want to launch in September, there's a detailed guide of how you can go through that process. So there's a real range of things, and perhaps we're a little bit too keen at Enactus of putting together massive packs for people to read, but I always find this one's very useful all the way throughout the year because it does have a checklist of activities. So it is useful to get across. Teams then who enter the summer action, there's a guide that get marked on how many of the actions they've undertaken. There's two categories: summer action champions, so the team that's done the most over the summer, and a most improved team. So there'll be 3 finalists in each. They do a video, there's a panel, and then both winners are awarded some grant funding. This year it's sponsored by Diageo, who provided £500 to both winners of the teams. And what we also do during the summer action week, something we introduced this year, themed weeks around the key areas. So we had recruitment 2 weeks, we had finance 2 weeks, and we had projects 2 weeks, and we had support network 2 weeks, where we introduced documents such as a recruitment plan or a financial budgeting tool, project model canvases, just so that we're sure in September that the majority of teams have the very basic documents that they need to be successful. Last year we had 30 teams entering summer action. You know, our goal is to get all 59 teams involved in that. It would be great, and even if they're not competing as such, there is value in every team getting involved in this process. And of course, if you're on campus, it's useful for them to be engaging with you during the summer period of time. We're obviously on hand to engage with the students as well. And hopefully some of them have some free time over the summer as well. But generally, the uptake has been growing every year, and we know that from feedback, teams do get a lot out of this process. These are some examples of the checklists, really simple things, but the kind of things that if they start ticking off, they know they'll be in a fairly sustainable place by the time we reach September. They're not expected to hit every single task, but if you think of a committee and you might have 6 to 10 members involved in activity, if everybody's got a checklist over the summer, it's not something they need to be working on incredibly hard, but it might be something they do once a week or every 2 weeks, and gives them a good excuse to have those Skype calls to talk to each other and review where they're at. And here's one on a project, on a needs assessment. So they really do cover the range of activities. So there's something for every member in the team to get involved with over the summer if they choose to do so. We're running a little bit over on time, but if you go on YouTube, you can search Enactus UK. We've got all the finalists from last year and the finalists from years back. Really interesting to look at some of these videos and understand the kind of work that teams can achieve. Last year, Enactus Manchester won our Summer Action Champion, and that's a team that's massively internationally based, and they still managed to get an awful lot of work done over the summer. And great to see Mark, great to see Enactus Sussex there is involved and winning Most Improved Team, which has been a fantastic journey that those guys have been on, and just shows how much can be achieved when you get involved the whole kind of year. And I think the success that the team is having right now is fantastic, and a lot of that is because they have engaged with all of the programs available to them. Was I going to say? No, that was the whistle stop tour of engagement, and hopefully that give you some ideas. But obviously, I'm open to any kind of questions or any points that I didn't go into any detail on there. If you'd like to explore anything further, then please let me know.
Thanks, Callum. Any questions at the moment? I mean, I think there's a lot of information and material to digest. And Callum just obviously put that video up, which I think would be a great way of inspiring the teams. And it does show that even if you have a lot of international students, spread across the world during the summer, if they plan and are up for a challenge, they can achieve an awful lot during that summer. Any closing thoughts, Bonnie? For those of you who joined from the second webinar for this handover and sustainability, there was some important updates at the beginning of the first webinar, but we will share the recording and the slides. So really we just talked about the individual topic competitions and the progress report deadlines, a new commercial project competition which Enactus UK is launching, discounted hotel rates for national competition, and also Bonnie is inviting suggestions for the format of the University Advisor Forum on the 9th of April at the national competition.
There's been a question from Hamali about how have other universities incentivized the students to engage over the summer?
Right. There's some really, I've seen some really innovative and interesting solutions. I've seen some universities offer placements or mini internships over the summer, whether that's in their enterprise department or in careers, so that they've got the team leader actually working on things, and either that's from an employability aspect, they've got another reference or a bit of experience, or that's actually paid employment for them, which has worked in probably 6 or 7 universities that I know off the top of my head. It might be that there are different grants available to projects perhaps over the summer that might be interesting for them to apply for. I'm not sure if anybody else has any ideas of something that's worked with them.
Mark has said that they're working on a mini summer internship, but they're not there yet. it's a nut we've not cracked in St Andrews, I have to say.
I think the idea of paying them as an incentive is quite interesting. I was thinking more about also about students who live internationally, to try and get them to engage and work together through these frameworks and packs that you put together.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, one of the easiest ways in real terms is they've got to have a hunger and interest for Enactus as a program as a whole. And the idea is that very few people, I imagine, leave nationals not feeling very inspired and very excited about what can happen. And when you look at the list of teams who have been finalists in the summer action competitions over the last few years, you'll see that traditionally they've gone on to perform well at national competition. So kind of off the back of their participation and attending events, hopefully you get as many as possible at places like Expo. Then normally that kind of incentivizes it to show that there's a link between that. If you want to be successful, it tends to be the teams that are the most successful ones, whether that's just project impact or whether that's competition impact. They're the ones that tended to have engaged with different programs.
So I guess it's also worth kind of throughout the year nurturing that culture within the team, and I guess reinforcing the values and purpose behind Enactus.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think it's part of that objective setting piece as well. I think that there always needs to be an understanding that yes, not everybody is going to be able to work over the summer, and setting a realistic expectation that it's not you're expecting students to deliver hour upon hour every week, but it might be saying, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and kind of agreeing that structure. I think that structure needs to be agreed before people leave, because if it's something they're trying to do when everybody's already gone remote, then it tends to be very difficult to do that.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Okay, thank you.
Well, if there are no more questions or comments or thoughts, in the interest of time, I'd just like to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and particularly thank you to Callum for all of your experience and all of your insights and all of your guidelines. So we really appreciate that. And thanks to Rosie as well. And I look forward to seeing you all at the next check-in.
Thanks very much, Bonnie.
Everybody.
Thank you, everyone.